In this video, we'll be learning about the cells of the nervous system. By the end of the video, you should be able to tell me what the two different main types of cells are in the nervous system, as well as the parts of the neuron. The nervous system is made up of two main types of cells, neurons and glia. Neurons are the main communicators of the nervous system. All neurons have the same basic components: dendrites, a cell body, axon and axon terminals, which we'll learn about momentarily. But neurons can look very different. The structure of the neuron is going to determine the function of the neuron. And again, in a couple of slides, I'll show you some different types of neurons. And we have about 86 billion neurons in the nervous system. This number has changed. About 10 years ago, it was thought we had about 100 billion neurons. And then a researcher came along and developed this new technique to determine the number of neurons. And so we're sitting at 86 billion neurons in our nervous system, and we're born with those 86 billion neurons. And basically, that's it. We don't we don't add new neurons if one dies. We have a very limited amount of neurogenesis that happens only in particular areas of the brain, such as the hippocampus and the olfactory region. The second type of cell in the nervous system are glia, and they are so named because they were once thought to be the glue of the brain. They just were thought to hold the brain together, and they have many different functions now that we are now aware of, and we'll discuss a few of them on the coming slides. But an important thing for you to note is that the glia outnumber the neurons about 10 to 1, and that's what this diagram over here is showing you. So here we have the neuron in green with its dendrites and its axon, and here's the cell body. And then all of these little red blobs are actually the glia. And so it's just kind of showing you that the glia do outnumber the neurons. We know today, again, like I said, there's many different functions of the glia acting as immune cells in the brain and cleaning it up, synchronizing the neurons, speeding up neural communication. But discussing all these different functions is beyond the scope of this class. This slide is just showing you the variety in the way that neurons can look. They all have the same basic structures. They have your dendrites, your cell body, and your axon terminals, which we'll talk about momentarily. But you can see they have such a wide range of structure, and that structure determines their function in the nervous system. And of course, the function and the structure is going to be determined by genetics, the location in the brain, and so on. This is just showing you the different types of glia that we have. So here's a neuron with its cell body and its dendrite and its axon. And we have one type of glia, an oligodendrocyte, that makes the myelin sheath up. We have another one, an astrocyte, that helps with the blood-brain barrier. It has these little foot processes that go around axon terminals and synapses and help synchronize activity. We have microglia that act as the immune cells in the brain. Now we'll go over the parts of a neuron. So we'll go over them each individually, but I just want to kind of orient you. Here we have the cell body, or the soma. We have these dendrites up here. Then we have this long extending fiber that's called the axon, and it ends in these axon terminals. So the dendrites are tree-like branches, and they're going to receive information from other neurons. They receive this information in the form of neurotransmitters, and so these tree-like branches are lined with receptors for these neurotransmitters, and we'll talk about those neurotransmitters momentarily. The cell body, sometimes called the soma, I'll mostly refer to it as the cell body, keeps that cell alive, and it's going to also determine if it's going to fire an action potential. Now you can see here the cell body contains the nucleus, and so obviously that's where the genetic material is, but it also, the cell body contains all that other machinery that you might have learned about in a biology class, the mitochondria, ribosomes, and the plasmic reticulum. Some of that can be also found in other parts of the neuron, but the cell body definitely houses all of that machinery. The axon is this long extending fiber, and it's going to be the same diameter, the entire length, and it is going to be where the action potential travels down, so that neural impulse. And so we'll briefly talk about that, but the action potential is what allows the cells to communicate. And so the cell body is going to determine if the cell will fire that action potential, and then that action potential will travel down the axon, away from the cell body. Now the myelin sheath shown here is a fatty substance that is going to insulate the axons. And you might remember from the couple previous slides where we saw the oligodendrocyte, which is a type of glia, and it wrapped around the axon. Well, that's what forms the myelin sheath. And the purpose of the myelin sheath is to speed up the action potentials. Nodes of Ranvier are these little gaps in the action potential, and that's actually, or in the axon, and that is actually where the action potential will occur, and that's how the myelin sheath speeds up the action potential. So the nodes of Ranvier are gaps in the myelin, and they are, again, important in the action potential. And we won't really go into that much in this introductory to psychology class, but if you take a psychobiology class, you'll learn a little bit more about that. The axon terminals, sometimes called synaptic boutons, are the ends of the axons that branch out and make more connections to the next cell. So they're the ends of the axons, and they are going to release neurotransmitter. So the dendrites receive that neurotransmitter on receptors that are lining the dendrites. The cell body gets that information, determines if it's going to fire an action potential. If it does, that action potential goes down the axon to these axon terminals, and there that signal turns back into a chemical signal where it releases neurotransmitters onto a receiving neuron. So the synapse is a specialized gap between neurons. And so this is showing you here, we have an axon of one neuron, ending in those axon terminals, and it's synapsing on the dendrites of another neuron. So typically enlarged here, this is the ending of that axon terminal, and it's going to be connecting and synapsing on this postsynaptic neuron, which is typically the dendrite. And in this class, we'll talk exclusively about axonal dendritic connections. But just keep in mind the axon can sometimes synapse on the cell body or itself even. So the presynaptic neuron, again, this is the presynaptic neuron here, or shown here as well. This is just enlarged. So that presynaptic neuron is the neuron that delivers the synaptic transmission. What you see here in these little circles, they're actually spheres that contain neurotransmitter, and it's going to release that neurotransmitter onto the receiving neuron. The postsynaptic neuron is the neuron that receives the messages, and you can see here these little cylinders are actually representing synaptic receptors, and these receptors are specialized proteins that neurotransmitters bind and allow communication between neurons. So the presynaptic neuron is going to release neurotransmitters. So these are these little dots that you see here in this specialized gap, and they're going to bind these synaptic receptors, and that's how the neurons communicate. So when these neurotransmitters bind, they're going to alter the activity of the receiving neuron.